as soon as you and other nations began to develop writing and everything else necessary for civilized life. After a certain period of time, torrents from the sky are unleashed like a flood, leaving only those among you who lack literacy and education. And you must start all over again like children, knowing nothing about what happened in ancient times. You only remember one flood, but there were many before it. Moreover, you don't even know that the most splendid and noblest race of people lived on your earth. Plato, 4th century BC. Officially, European civilization began with the Roman Empire. The Romans built public toilets, public baths, thermal baths, roads, bridges, and dams. Then, for some inexplicable reason, Europe plunged into the darkness of the Middle Ages. Here is some information about what happened in Europe in the Middle Ages. Chamber pots were thrown out of windows, often on the heads of passersby, which led to the invention of wide-brimmed hats. The familiar gesture of men lifting their hats to women originally meant shaking the shit off their hats as sewage flowed through the streets. This led to the invention of high-heeled shoes and raised platforms for walking. They even came up with ingenious devices for walking the streets. Domestic animals like horses, cows, and pigs lived in cities, adding manure to already dirty towns. Medieval travelers describing Paris noted that the stench from the city spread for several kilometers. Not only the common people, but also officials degenerated. In castles, they held endless balls and feasts. An ordinary pastime for them was flea hunting on themselves and their table neighbors. Lovers wore special amulets around their necks to keep a flea from their beloved person. On their chest, ladies carried small dogs with them so that fleas would jump to the dog, as dogs have a higher body temperature. Lice and syphilis, which almost everyone suffered from at the time, led to baldness, and wigs were invented to conceal the lack of hair. People bathed once or twice in their lifetime during baptism and on their wedding day. People of that time emitted a very strong odor, so perfumes were invented to mask this horrendous smell. Hygiene and medicine are indicators of societal development. Regarding medicine in those times, almost all diseases were treated with bloodletting. During childbirth, doctors didn't wash their hands, which led to puerperal fever in 30% of women, caused by blood contamination. Not less than half of the women died. The connection between the unwashed hands of doctors and puerperal fever was first suggested in the mid-19th century by the brilliant obstetrician and scientist Ignaz Semmelweis, who worked in Budapest. He noticed that hospital doctors often went directly from the autopsy room, where they dissected corpses to deliver babies. Moreover, doctors of that time did not wash their hands after working with corpses. They simply wiped them off quickly with a cloth and then proceeded to deliver babies. Unfortunately, the scientific community of the time ridiculed Semmelweis's idea, and it was only recognized 18 years after his theory was published. Mandatory disinfection of the hands of medical personnel before childbirth was introduced everywhere, in maternity homes in the second half of the 19th century. Now, let's move to the 18th century at balls and feasts. Diners went to the toilet behind a corner or behind a curtain. After the castle was significantly soiled, the noble public moved to another castle, dirtied it, and then occupied the next one. By the way, one can think about this question: why did they go behind a curtain or corner? Were there no toilets, or did the sewage system not work? If there were no toilets at all, then the castles were indeed industrial buildings of that time, perhaps factories or workshops that were used for other purposes after the disaster. If the sewer system didn't work, then why? What event plunged the entire European civilization into the darkness of the Middle Ages? By the way, something similar happened after the collapse of the USSR in some republics. Specialists left the cities, which plunged into chaos. There was no electricity, no heating, no water supply. I vividly remember television reports from the 1990s, where electricity from generators was sold by the hour in abandoned apartment buildings, and heating in freezing houses was organized by installing improvised stoves in kitchens. In other words, in Europe at that time, there was a certain civilization, something like the USSR or the USA, which was developing the economy, industry, and civilization. Then, after a catastrophe that did not make it into history and about which we know nothing, This civilization disintegrated. Let's go back to castles. Are there similar examples in modern times? It turns out there are. Let me read an article. We will talk about the city of Johannesburg in South Africa. Johannesburg is a modern city with skyscrapers, and in South Africa, there was its own space program. The country possessed nuclear technology and weapons. In South Africa, the world's first heart transplant was performed. The story comes from an immigrant living in Cape Town at that time. So, at one fine moment, treacherously and without declaring war, a couple of million locals entered Johannesburg. They simply left their settled places and went where it smelled better. He lived in Johannesburg at the time and told the following in the midst of a working day. Out of nowhere, there was a sudden acting. The doors of the community center opened, and a few thousand locals infiltrated the building in a disorganized, but cheerful and positive manner. The guests arrived with their belongings and treasure. They asked not to pay attention to them and continue working. Meanwhile, they began to occupy inefficiently used spaces from their perspective, evenly spreading across the office, taking up free chairs, sofas, and chairs, occupying toilets and corridors while removing all the shiny souvenirs from those around them. The building was filled with life and joyful bustle. They caught and gutted birds in the corridors, prepared food in the meeting rooms, and bathed in the toilets. When asked politely how to interpret this, they simply replied that they would now live there. On the clarifying question, how is that possible? They answered that it would be better for everyone. The police were called, but they didn't show up. The police said they couldn't come because the same situation was happening in their areas. Then, everyone who could began quietly fleeing to the suburbs and towards Cape Town, while setting up defenses, trenches, rows, and barbed wire fences with electricity. After the owners of the buildings fled, they started thinking about what to do. They came up with a plan. They decided that if they turned off the invaders' electricity and water with colonization, they would leave the building on their own and return to the savannah. They turned it off. The invaders didn't even notice. It seems that they didn't have electricity, water, or sanitation in the savannah anyway. You might ask, where did they relieve themselves then? It turned out that the invaders, while getting settled in the buildings, couldn't understand the functionality of elevator shafts. When the invaders opened the doors, they speculated for a long time, spitting down, wondering why this hole was there. Then they guessed and credited it to the intelligence of skyscraper builders. How cleverly they thought of everything, the invaders thought. They began to mass and throw trash into the elevator shafts. According to the immigrants' words, the crowd of invaders would completely fill the building with rubbish up to the roof in about 10 years. And then, just like in the good prehistoric times, they would move to a new pasture, populating a new skyscraper. In Johannesburg, a new informal service emerged. Some tough guys offer building owners a service for regaining control of their buildings. At some point, a couple of hundred tough guys, armed to the teeth, quietly and calmly, trying not to wake the peacefully sleeping invaders, start taking back the building, forcefully evicting all the newcomers. And until they came to their senses and went to ask what was it actually all about, they barricade all entrances and exits, dig trenches, stretch wire, and run electricity through it. Then, after the building is brought to its senses, they put it back into operation. Africa's tallest residential building, standing at 567 feet with an internal atrium, was known among the city dwellers for its unprecedented views of the city. In 1990, after the end of apartheid, gangs took over the abandoned high-rise, turning the elite condominium into a breeding ground for crime, drug addiction, and AIDS. The bottom of the atrium served as a 5-story high dump. A very similar situation occurred in Europe several hundred years ago. A more civilized society built castles, and in my version, castles were the industrial buildings of those times. Then something happened and new people came there, who started using the castles according to their own understanding, conducting feasts during which they defiled the corners and curtains. And after it became impossible to stay in the building, they moved to a new castle. My name is Professor Aristotle. Subscribe and turn on notifications so as not to miss my new videos. YouTube has already deleted 2 of my videos and few people could see them. And this is where we finish with you, and see you again on my channel.